I remember the first time my grandpa showed me what he called the iron leaf. We were walking along the back fence line where the property met the old county road, and he stopped at a patch of green that looked like it was trying to take over the ditch. He bent down, pulled a leaf, and held it up to the light like it was worth something. "Billy Joe," he said, "this here plant's got more iron in it than all that spinach your mama buys at the store, and it don't cost a dime." I was maybe 8 years old, and I didn't understand why something that valuable would be growing wild where nobody wanted it. That was 30 years ago, and I've spent most of my life since then trying to figure out why a plant this good got treated like an enemy. My grandpa's people knew about it. My great-grandma cooked it every spring. Folks around here still talk about how their parents would pick it by the bushel and cook it down like collard greens, and nobody ever went anemic when they ate it regular. But somewhere between her generation and mine, this plant went from being food to being something you'd spray poison on. That's not an accident. That's a choice somebody made, and it wasn't the people who needed the iron. This plant breaks every rule that modern agriculture wants you to follow. It doesn't need fertilizer because it pulls nitrogen from the air and fixes it in the soil. It doesn't need pesticides because nothing much bothers it. It doesn't need irrigation because the taproot goes down 6 feet and finds water where your tomatoes would die of thirst. And it spreads so fast that one plant can turn into 10,000 in a single season if you let it go to seed. That's the kind of abundance that should make people celebrate, but instead it made people nervous. When something grows that well without being bought, sold, or controlled, it becomes a problem for the people who make money selling you solutions. My grandpa told me that his father remembered when every farm had a patch of this growing somewhere, usually in the poorest soil where nothing else would take. They'd let it grow thick, harvest it young, and feed it to the family all through the spring and summer. The leaves were tender when small, tough when old, but always packed with nutrition that kept people working hard through lean times. He said the old folks called it a survival plant, the kind of thing that showed up when you needed it most and asked nothing in return except that you leave a few plants to seed for next year. But I also remember watching that plant disappear. By the time I was in high school, you couldn't find it at any store. Nobody talked about eating it anymore. The county extension office started putting out flyers calling it a noxious weed and recommending chemicals to kill it. I asked my grandpa why something so useful had turned into something so hated, and he looked at me with that tired expression he got when he talked about things changing for the worse. "Son," he said, "some plants get erased because they fail. This one got erased because it succeeded without asking permission." That's when I started paying attention to which plants were told to value and which ones were told to destroy, and I realized the difference usually comes down to who profits. This is the story of that plant, the iron leaf that wouldn't quit, and the systems that tried to bury it. My great-grandpa's people knew this plant by a name that didn't come from any book. The Cherokees called it something close to blood builder in their language, though the exact word got lost somewhere between his generation and mine. What didn't get lost was the reason for that name. They used it when women were weak after childbirth, when children looked pale and tired, when the long winters left people feeling like their strength had drained into the frozen ground. This plant brought the color back to their faces and the energy back to their work. That knowledge didn't come from laboratories or studies. It came from watching what happened when people ate it regular and comparing that to what happened when they didn't. The old folks passed down stories about this plant showing up on land that had been farmed too hard, soil that couldn't grow corn or beans anymore because the nutrients had been pulled out year after year. They said this plant would arrive like a gift, covering the tired ground with green leaves that somehow found fertility where nothing else could. And when they harvested those leaves and tilled the rest back into the soil, the land would wake up again. The next year, crops that had failed before would suddenly thrive. My great-grandpa said his father told him that the Cherokees understood this plant as medicine for both people and earth, and they never tried to control where it grew, because controlling it would miss the point. Folks around here still talk about the old way of gathering it. You'd go out in early morning when the dew was still on the leaves, and you'd pick only the young tender growth from the top 6 inches of the plant. The older leaves lower down were too tough and bitter, but those young ones at the crown were mild enough to eat raw if you wanted, though most people cooked them down with a little bacon fat or ham hock. My great-grandma said her mother would fill a cotton sack with those leaves, bring them home and wash them 3 times in cold spring water to get the grit out. Then she'd cook them slow in a big iron pot, and the whole house would smell like earth and green growing things. That smell meant survival. It meant your blood would stay strong and your children wouldn't go hungry, even when money was scarce. What strikes me now is how that knowledge moved through generations without anyone writing it down or claiming to own it. The Cherokees taught the settlers taught their children, those children taught theirs. For maybe 200 years in these mountains, people just knew that this plant was food and medicine combined, and they knew where to find it and how to use it. There were no patents on that knowledge, no companies selling seeds, no experts telling you the right way and the wrong way, just people watching the land, noticing what grew strong, and having the sense to eat it. But that kind of knowledge makes some folks uncomfortable. When medicine grows wild and free, when food shows up without being planted, when the poorest soil produces the most nutrition, it raises questions about why we're paying so much for things that nature offers for nothing. My great-grandpa used to say that the Cherokee name for this plant wasn't just describing what it did for your blood. It was describing a whole different way of thinking about wealth, where abundance came from paying attention instead of paying money. That way of thinking didn't survive contact with the modern world, and neither did the plant's reputation. My great-grandma was born in 1911, and she lived through the kind of poverty that most people today can't imagine. By the time the Depression hit in 1929, she already had 3 children and a husband who'd lost his job at the lumber mill. She told me stories about those years that still make my chest tight when I think about them. The garden failed in 1932 because the drought was so bad that even the well went dry. They had no money for store-bought food. The government relief programs hadn't reached our county yet, and she watched her babies get thin and pale in a way that terrified her because she knew what came next if she couldn't find something to feed 'em. That's when she remembered what her mother had taught her about the iron leaf. It was growing thick along the creek bed about a 1/4 mile from the house, in soil that stayed damp even when everything else turned to dust. She said she walked down there every morning before sunrise and picked enough to fill a flour sack, then carried it back and cooked it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Her children ate those greens with cornbread when there was cornmeal, and plain when there wasn't. She told me that within 2 weeks the color came back to their faces. Within a month, they had energy to play again. That plant kept her family alive through the worst 18 months of the Depression, and she wasn't the only one who knew to use it. Folks around here still talk about how the ditches and roadsides were picked clean of that plant during those years. Every family that had the knowledge was out gathering it, and the families that didn't have the knowledge learned fast by watching their neighbors. My great-grandma said there was a kind of unspoken agreement that you didn't take more than you needed, and you always left some to go to seed so it would come back next year. People understood that this plant was keeping them alive, and they treated it with the respect you'd give anything that stood between your children and starvation. But she also told me about what happened after the Depression ended and things started getting better. The government men came around in the late 1930s with new ideas about scientific farming and modern agriculture. They brought pamphlets showing the right vegetables to grow and the right ways to grow them. They talked about hybrid seeds and chemical fertilizers and how the old ways of doing things were holding people back from prosperity. And they looked at the wild plants people had been eating and called them weeds. My great-grandma said she tried to tell one of those men that the iron leaf had saved her family, and he smiled at her like she was simple and said that modern nutrition science had better solutions than eating roadside weeds. She watched over the next 10 years as people stopped gathering that plant. The younger generation wanted store-bought spinach and chard from the seed catalogs because that's what the government pamphlets recommended. The old knowledge about which wild plants were food started to feel like embarrassing poverty rather than practical wisdom. By the time I was born in the 1970s, my great-grandma was one of the few people left who still cooked the iron leaf, and even she had started calling it by the name the Extension Office used, the name that marked it as something to eliminate rather than celebrate. She lived to be 93 years old, sharp-minded until the end, and she told me before she died that watching people forget that plant was like watching them forget how to survive. I saw this happen with my own eyes, so I know it's true. In 1975, a researcher from the State Agricultural College came through our county doing a nutrition survey of wild edible plants. My grandpa heard about it and brought the man to our back fence, where the iron leaf was growing thick. The researcher took samples, labeled them carefully in plastic bags, and said he'd send the results to my grandpa when the lab work was done. 3 months later, an envelope arrived with numbers that my grandpa kept in his desk drawer until the day he died. I still have that paper. The iron content was measured at 3.5 milligrams per 100 grams of raw leaves, compared to spinach at 2.7 milligrams. But that wasn't the number that shocked him. The protein content came back at 4.2 grams per 100 grams of leaves, higher than most vegetables anyone bothered to cultivate. My grandpa showed those numbers to everyone who'd listen, but nobody seemed to care much. The Extension Office agent looked at the paper and said that spinach was still the recommended green for iron because it had been studied more thoroughly. The doctor in town said supplements were more reliable than wild plants for treating anemia. Even my own mother, who'd eaten that plant as a child, told my grandpa that she preferred buying vegetables from the store because you knew they were safe. That word, safe, stuck with me because it revealed how the thinking had changed. A plant that had fed people for generations was now considered risky, while vegetables sprayed with chemicals and shipped 1,000 miles were considered trustworthy. The science said one thing, but the culture had already decided something else. The researcher published his findings in a small agricultural journal that nobody outside the university system ever read. I found a copy of that article years later when I went looking for it. He'd tested dozens of wild edibles, and this plant ranked in the top 5 for overall nutrition density. He noted that it required no cultivation, no fertilization, no pest management, and no irrigation in most climates. He calculated that an acre of this plant, if harvested properly, could produce more edible protein and iron than an acre of spinach with a fraction of the inputs. His conclusion suggested that wild edibles deserved more attention as food sources, especially in areas where conventional agriculture struggled. That paper should have changed things. It didn't. I remember asking my grandpa why good science didn't matter if it contradicted what people wanted to believe. He said that numbers only convince people when the numbers support what they're already selling. A plant that grows wild and free doesn't support any business model. You can't patent it. You can't sell the seeds year after year because it reseeds itself. You can't sell the fertilizer because it doesn't need any. You can't sell the pesticides because it grows fine without them. Every virtue that makes it valuable to a family makes it worthless to an industry. So the science gets published, filed away, and forgotten while the stores keep selling spinach at $2 a bunch. But here's what nobody could argue with then, and still can't argue with now. The people who ate this plant regularly didn't suffer from iron deficiency. The children who grew up eating it had strong blood and steady energy. The families that knew how to use it survived hard times that broke families who didn't. That's not folklore or superstition. That's observable fact backed by both traditional knowledge and laboratory analysis. The plant worked exactly as well as my great-grandma said it did, and the science proved her right decades after she'd already known. I need to tell you exactly why this plant disappeared, because the reason matters more than most people want to admit. This plant vanished from American tables and gardens not because it failed to deliver nutrition, not because it tasted bad, and not because people stopped needing iron. It vanished because it succeeded too well at being free. Between 1960 and 1985, 12 states added this plant to their noxious weed lists. I've read those legislative records. The language they used was all about agricultural threat and invasive characteristics, but when you dig into who was lobbying for those laws, you find seed companies and agricultural chemical manufacturers showing up at every hearing. My grandpa told me about a meeting that happened at the county courthouse in 1978. The state agriculture department sent a representative to explain why farmers needed to eradicate this plant from their properties. The rep stood up there with charts showing how fast it spread, how deep the roots went, how difficult it was to control once established. He made it sound like a threat to farming itself. But my grandpa raised his hand and asked a simple question that didn't get a straight answer. He said, if this plant builds soil, feeds people, and grows without any inputs, why are we treating it like the enemy? The rep stammered something about monoculture efficiency and modern agricultural standards. What he meant but didn't say was that a plant you can't control is a plant you can't profit from. The seed industry had a particular problem with this plant because it made their product irrelevant. Why would anyone buy spinach seeds, chard seeds, or kale seeds when this plant volunteered itself every spring without being asked? Why would anyone buy those packets year after year when this plant reseeded itself forever? I saw the advertising campaigns that started appearing in farm magazines during the 1970s. They showed beautiful photographs of neat garden rows with hybrid vegetables, and in the margins there were warnings about wild plants that could contaminate your careful planning. They never named this plant specifically in the ads, but the descriptions matched perfectly. The message was clear. Real farmers grew what they bought, not what nature provided. Then the chemical companies got involved, and that's when things got aggressive. Herbicide manufacturers developed formulas specifically marketed for controlling broadleaf plants in pastures and ditches. The advertisement showed this exact plant in the before photos, withered and dead in the after photos. I remember those ads running in every farm publication through the 1980s. They called it pasture management and roadside maintenance, but what they were really doing was normalizing the idea that this plant needed to be eliminated. And because the plant couldn't be patented or owned, nobody had any financial incentive to defend it. There was no company running counter ads saying, actually, this plant is valuable. There was just a one-sided campaign to rebrand food as a weed. Folks around here still talk about how the county started spraying the roadsides in 1982. They said it was for visibility and safety, keeping the vegetation low so drivers could see around curves. But they were using herbicides that specifically targeted this plant while leaving grasses alone. Within 3 years, you couldn't find it growing wild along the roads anymore. You had to know where to look in the back hollows and forgotten fence lines to find patches that had escaped the spraying. My grandpa saved seeds from those patches and kept them in a jar in his workshop, and he told me that saving those seeds felt like an act of resistance against people who wanted to decide what deserved to grow. I watched this happen in 1983, and it still makes me angry when I think about it. 2 men in clean trucks with Monsanto logos on the doors came through our county holding meetings at the feed store and the co-op. They wore polo shirts and brought free coffee and donuts, and they had a presentation all set up on a projector showing slides of healthy pastures versus overgrown ones. The whole pitch was about maximizing land productivity and eliminating plants that competed with valuable forage grasses. But when you looked closely at their slides, almost every problem plant they showed was the iron leaf. They had developed a herbicide blend specifically formulated to kill it while leaving most grasses untouched, and they were giving away free sample jugs to any farmer who'd sign up for their mailing list. My grandpa went to one of those meetings because he wanted to hear what they were saying. He told me afterward that the Monsanto reps never once mentioned that the plant was edible. They never said it built soil or fixed nitrogen. They just kept calling it an aggressive colonizer that reduced pasture quality and needed to be managed before it got out of control. One farmer asked if the plant had any value, and the rep said something about how modern agriculture had moved beyond relying on wild species, and that controlled, predictable crops were the foundation of food security. My grandpa walked out before the presentation ended because he said he couldn't stomach watching people get sold poison to kill food. But most farmers stayed and listened, and a lot of them took those free jugs home. I saw the results that summer. Fields that had always shown patches of the iron leaf growing along the edges and in the thin spots suddenly went bare. The plant died fast when hit with that chemical, and it didn't come back the next year like it usually would. The Monsanto reps came back around in 1984 with more free samples and then started selling the product at the co-op for regular price. By then, farmers were hooked on the results. They liked seeing their pastures uniform and clean. They liked the feeling of control that came from deciding exactly what grew and what didn't. The fact that they were killing free food and soil fertility didn't register because nobody was framing it that way anymore. I remember my grandpa taking me out to a neighbor's fence line where the spraying had happened. The iron leaf was brown and wilted, but right next to it, other plants were showing damage too. The clover was struggling. Some wildflowers that bees depended on were dying back. He pointed at the ground and said, "Billy Joe, when you start poisoning land to make it simpler, you don't just lose one plant. You lose the complexity that keeps everything healthy." He was right, but nobody wanted to hear that message when the Agricultural Extension Office and the chemical companies were all saying the same thing about progress and efficiency. The herbicide wars weren't just about this one plant. They were about establishing a principle that land should only grow what humans explicitly chose, and that everything else was a weed deserving elimination. That principle made fortunes for chemical companies and turned farmers into customers who had to buy solutions every year for problems that didn't exist before the solutions were invented. I watched it happen in real time. I saw free food get rebranded as a threat. I saw soil fertility get poisoned in the name of pasture management, and I saw my grandpa save more seeds and plant them in hidden spots where the spray trucks wouldn't reach, because he knew that someday people would remember what they'd lost and come looking for it again. This part of the story took me years to piece together because nobody talks about it openly, but the evidence is there if you know where to look. In 1989, the pharmaceutical industry was making serious money selling iron supplements. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars annually just in the United States. Those supplements were recommended for pregnant women, people with anemia, athletes, and anyone who showed up at a doctor's office complaining of fatigue. The pills were cheap to manufacture and sold at high markups, and the business model depended on people believing that dietary iron from food wasn't sufficient for modern health needs. Then something inconvenient started happening in the natural health community. Folks around here still talk about the herbalist who set up shop in Asheville in 1987. She wasn't from around here originally, But she'd learned about wild edibles from an old-timer and started teaching classes about nutritional plants that grew free. She specifically promoted the iron leaf as superior to supplements because the iron came packaged with vitamin C and other cofactors that improved absorption. Her classes got popular, people started gathering the plant again and reporting that their energy improved and their blood tests showed better iron levels. Word spread through natural food stores and alternative health networks. By 1990, there were articles in small health magazines talking about wild edibles as alternatives to supplements. That's when the pharmaceutical lobby started paying attention. I found documentation of this in state legislative archives when I went digging years later. Between 1991 and 1995, pharmaceutical industry lobbyists showed up at state agriculture committee meetings in at least 8 states, pushing for stricter noxious weed classifications. They didn't say they were worried about supplement sales. They said they were concerned about public safety and the risk of people consuming unregulated plants that might be contaminated or misidentified. They brought doctors who testified that wild plant consumption was dangerous without proper oversight. They brought toxicology reports about other plants entirely and implied that all wild edibles carried similar risks. And they succeeded in getting the iron leaf added to noxious weed lists in states where it had previously been unregulated. The language in those laws was clever. They didn't ban consumption directly because that would have been too obvious. They just made it illegal to knowingly allow the plant to grow on your property or to transport it across county lines. That meant farmers' markets couldn't sell it, herbalists couldn't teach about it without risking legal trouble, and anyone growing it deliberately could be fined by the county. The effect was to push the plant back underground, back to the margins, back to being something only old-timers remembered and nobody young would learn about. Meanwhile, iron supplement sales continued growing year after year. My grandpa told me in the mid-1990s that he'd watched this pattern repeat with other useful plants throughout his lifetime. Whenever something natural and free started threatening a profitable industry, that industry would find ways to eliminate the competition without making it look like competition. They'd use safety concerns, regulatory frameworks, and public health language to accomplish what was really just market protection. He said the pharmaceutical companies weren't evil, just predictable. They were doing what all industries do when their profits get threatened. They were using the law to eliminate alternatives that they couldn't control or monetize. What makes me angriest about this isn't that it happened, it's that it worked so completely that most people today have no idea it happened at all. They take their iron pills and never wonder why their grandparents didn't need 'em. They see this plant growing wild and call it a weed without knowing it could replace what they're buying at the pharmacy. That's not an accident. That's the result of a quiet, effective campaign to erase knowledge that threatened profits. Something started changing around 2010, and I got to watch it happen from the inside. I was selling vegetables at a farmer's market in Asheville, and a woman at the booth next to mine started bringing bundles of wild greens that she'd foraged from her property. Most of it was the usual stuff people recognized, like ramps and watercress. But one week, she brought the iron leaf. She had it labeled as amaranth greens, which was technically correct, but not the name anyone around here had ever used. I watched people walk past it all morning without much interest until one older woman stopped, picked up a bunch, and started crying right there at the market. She told us her grandmother had cooked this plant during the Depression, and she hadn't seen it in 40 years. She bought every bundle the forager had brought. That moment started something. The forager brought more the next week and the week after that. Other vendors started asking where she found it and whether they could sell it too. Within a year, 3 different booths at that market were offering the iron leaf under various names like wild amaranth, pigweed greens, and quilits. The customers who bought it came back asking for more and telling stories about their own grandparents cooking it. The plant was coming back into circulation through farmers' markets, moving hand to hand the same way knowledge used to move before everything got centralized and controlled. Nobody was asking permission. Nobody was waiting for the agriculture department to approve it. People were just growing it, selling it, and eating it again. Then the internet changed everything. Permaculture forums started exploding with posts about this plant around 2012. People were sharing seeds through the mail, trading growing tips, and posting photos of massive plants producing pounds of edible leaves from terrible soil. The homesteading blogs picked it up. The urban farming websites featured it. YouTube videos showed people harvesting it from vacant lots and cooking it a dozen different ways. What the chemical companies and pharmaceutical lobbyists had spent decades trying to erase was coming back through decentralized networks that couldn't be controlled or lobbied against. Every person who planted it and let it go to seed was creating thousands more plants that would spread to neighbors and empty spaces. The knowledge was reproducing itself faster than it could be suppressed. I started saving seeds again like my grandpa had taught me, but now I was mailing them to people in other states who'd found me through online forums. I sent seeds to a teacher in Portland who wanted to grow them with her students. I sent seeds to a community garden in Detroit that was focusing on plants that grew with minimal resources. I sent seeds to a veteran in New Mexico who was trying to grow food in desert conditions. Every envelope I mailed felt like I was undoing a small piece of the erasure that had happened during my lifetime. And I wasn't alone. There were dozens of people doing the same thing, building a seed network that operated outside the commercial system entirely. The revival isn't complete, and maybe never will be. You still can't buy this plant at regular grocery stores. The Agriculture Extension Office is still listed as a weed to control. The seed catalogs still don't carry it because it's too easy to save and share without buying more. But it's growing again in community gardens and permaculture plots and the yards of people who've decided that free food is worth the risk of annoying their neighbors. The knowledge that almost died with my great-grandma's generation is being remembered and taught and spread by people who understand that the best things in life are the ones that can't be owned, sold, or controlled by industries that profit from our dependence. I want to tell you what I see when I look at the ditches and fence lines around here now. The iron leaf is still growing in those forgotten spaces where the spray trucks don't reach and the developers haven't paved over yet. It's waiting there like it's always waited, producing seeds that can stay viable in the soil for decades, ready to sprout the moment conditions allow. That plant doesn't care about markets or regulations or what the agriculture department thinks. It just keeps doing what it's always done, turning sunlight and poor soil into nutrition that could feed people if they remembered how. The knowledge is waiting too, buried in old memories and handwritten recipe cards, and the stories that some of us still tell about the people who survived hard times by knowing which plants were food. My grandpa died in 2003, but before he went he made sure I understood something important. He said that every generation has to choose whether to remember or forget, and that forgetting always looks easier until you need what you've lost. He'd watched people forget how to survive without stores and systems and supply chains. He'd watched them become dependent on industries that charged money for things that used to be free, and he'd watched those industries use laws and chemicals and advertising to make sure the free alternatives disappeared so completely that people didn't even know they'd existed. But he also believed that knowledge has a way of surviving in the margins, in the people who refuse to forget, in the seeds saved and planted and shared when nobody's paying attention. I think about that every time I see someone discover this plant for the first time and realize what it is. Their faces change when they understand that something this nutritious grows wild and free, that their ancestors knew about it and used it, and that it was deliberately erased from common knowledge. That realization opens other questions about what else we've lost and why we lost it, and who benefited from the loss. Those are uncomfortable questions, because the answers reveal how much of what we call progress is really just the replacement of free abundance with profitable scarcity. But they're necessary questions if we want to stop repeating the same pattern of erasure with the next useful plant or the next piece of traditional knowledge that threatens someone's business model. The iron leaf is still here. It grows in every state where it hasn't been completely poisoned out of existence. The seeds are available if you know who to ask, and the knowledge of how to use it is coming back through the people who refuse to let it die. You can find it at some farmers' markets now. You can learn about it in permaculture courses and foraging classes. You can grow it in your own yard if you're willing to deal with neighbors who've been trained to see it as a weed. And you can be part of the generation that remembers instead of the generation that forgets, the one that passes this knowledge forward instead of letting it slip away into the silence that benefits industries built on our ignorance. This plant survived the Depression, the herbicide wars, the pharmaceutical lobby, and decades of systematic erasure. It survived because it's tougher than the systems that tried to eliminate it, and because a few stubborn people in every generation refuse to spray it, refuse to forget it, and refuse to accept that free food should be treated as a threat. The knowledge waits in the soil and in the seeds and in the stories we choose to tell. All you have to do is decide whether you're going to remember or forget. I know which choice my grandpa would want you to make. If this story matters to you, subscribe. There's more knowledge waiting to be remembered.